What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Share your moment in the comments, your place in time, as history quietly unfolds. And if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling helps you rest, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's return to a history too quiet for headlines, but too important to forget. Asterisk, it began, like so many Soviet problems, with a form marked in triplicate, carbon smudged, and signed in pencil, requesting shipment of 65,000 metric tons of Canadian wheat to be offloaded at the port of Odessa and distributed to collective farms across the Ukrainian USSR. The request was ordinary. There was nothing about it that warned of disaster. But in the bureaucratic arteries of the Soviet Union, where papers went missing in corridors longer than train lines, this single form would begin a quiet crisis. Not a coup, not a war, just a famine of miscommunication. The year was 1990. Glasnost had made people talk, but it hadn't made the trains run on time. Perestroika had opened the books, but the pages were still mostly empty. There were shortages of everything: meat, soap, fuel, but nothing made hearts drop like missing grain. In rural Mykolaiv, farmers waited. The plan was simple. Imported grain would supplement the failed domestic harvest. The USSR had long depended on foreign wheat since Khrushchev's era, but now dependence had become desperation. The trains were scheduled to arrive in December, just as the last reserves of local flour ran out, but no trains came to the port of Odessa. The wheat sat, mountains of it, soft, golden mounds stored in metal silos and in rusted ships that waited, idling, because no one had told them to move. Somewhere between the Ministry of External Trade and the Ministry of Railways, the routing forms were delayed, or lost, or perhaps signed by the wrong regional deputy who had since retired, or who had stopped showing up entirely. What mattered was the silence that followed. No one answered the phones. In Soviet planning, nothing moved unless it was ordered to move, a country where initiative was punished and obedience rewarded. No one below dared reroute grain without the right stamp. The rail depot in Kherson asked for instructions. They received none, so they waited, and the grain remained locked in Odessa, behind an invisible wall. In the countryside, waiting took on a different shape. Women queued for bread that never came. Men stood in frost-covered courtyards, holding ration cards that no longer promised anything. Schools stopped serving lunches. In some regions, flour was mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. In others, bakeries closed entirely. The news did not cover the shortages. Pravda was still more truth-adjacent than truth. Instead, rumors grew. Some said the Americans had canceled shipments. Others said Ukrainian officials were hoarding grain for separatists. A few whispered that Moscow wanted the peasants to starve, to punish them for growing restless. Most just stopped asking. They ate less, they bundled more, and they waited for the trains. But inside the local party offices, a quieter panic set in. These were not evil men, just tired ones. Men who had climbed a ladder of obedience for decades and now found that there was no longer a ladder. They held titles like Regional Grain Allocation Officer and Deputy Director of Logistical Affairs, important-sounding names for people who could do nothing. They called Odessa. Odessa didn't answer. One man, Valery Dmitriev, a mid-level transportation planner in Venetia, did something unusual. He took a train himself. He rode overnight to Odessa in the frozen dark, arriving in a cheap wool coat and a notebook full of numbers. He had worked in the system for 28 years. He knew the rules, but he was tired of watching children cry in bread lines. He just wanted to know where the grain was. What he found was a port full of food, guarded by silence. Odessa's administrators did not know where to send the grain. The original routing orders were vague. No one wanted to sign off on improvisation. There was talk of fuel shortages, of broken rail cars, of missing crews. But mostly, there was fear. If they sent the grain without orders, they risked punishment. If they didn't send it, no one would notice except the people starving hundreds of kilometers away. Valery walked the docks. He spoke to guards. He noted the number of sealed containers, the dates on manifests. The grain had been sitting for weeks. Some of it had begun to mold. Rats had found their way in. He returned to Venetia with photos taken secretly. He tried again to reach Kiju. No one returned his calls. The local officers told him to be patient. It was a word people used a lot in 1990. Patience. Comrade, we must be patient. But patience did not bring bread. Elsewhere in the Union, similar scenes unfolded. In Siberia, coal was mined, but not shipped. In Latvia, milk curdled in silos while stores ran dry. In Georgia, citrus fruit rotted on the trees because there was no fuel to move it. Everywhere, things were stuck not from sabotage, but from the slow decay of communication. The Soviet Union did not collapse with a bang. It sagged like an old house left unattended, where the roof leaks for years before finally caving in. This grain shipment to Ukraine was just one leak. But in the winter of 1990, it mattered, because in the quiet of these forgotten towns, hunger changed everything. It drained the strength of belief. The myth of a powerful center eroded. People no longer feared the government. They simply stopped believing it could help. Valery tried one last time. He faxed his report to Moscow. He heard nothing. By March, the grain had still not arrived. Instead, spring brought small protests. Women with scarves over their heads, standing in neat lines outside empty bakeries, holding signs that asked simple questions. Where is the grain? The signs were ignored, but the questions lingered, and by then, the mold had spread. Valery Dmitriev's final fax sat unacknowledged in the bin-marked regional logistics. Somewhere in a gray building off Kalinian Prospect in Moscow, the fluorescent lights flickered. The heating worked intermittently. And the man assigned to read the faxes, Sergei Ivanov, Department 3C, Logistics, Clearance, and Distribution Authority, had stopped showing up 3 weeks earlier. No one replaced him. His chair simply remained empty, a stack of unattended papers slowly curling under their own weight. This was the year the system quietly stopped pretending to work. In theory, Soviet Union still operated with precision. Maps hung in ministries. Red pens marking distribution routes. Black pens indicating delays. Telephones rang, and people still answered them some of the time. But the will had drained out of the bureaucracy. The ideological heart of the state had gone dry. And so, in cities like Venetia, Kibo waited for shipments from departments that no longer answered to anyone. Moscow was a city in transition. By mid-1990, the talk among officials had shifted from long-term 5-year plans to short-term political survival. Ministries competed against each other. Leaders jockeyed for television airtime. The General Secretary's speeches were broadcast with subtitles because few even listened anymore. The new language of reformed glasnost, perestroika, had lost its potency. They had opened the windows and cold air had rushed in. Valery's report, so carefully documented with photographs and serial numbers and port records, was passed along once to another office that no longer had authority over grain shipments. Eventually, it was misfiled under industrial output, Ukraine region, and disappeared into the folds of collapsing Soviet paperwork. Meanwhile, back in Venetia, the silence became its own kind of reply. The bread lines now stretched through alleyways. People brought folding stools. Mothers traded sewing needles for half loaves. Rumors hardened into certainty. Moscow had abandoned them. No one announced it. No one wrote it down. But but you could feel it in the way officials avoided eye contact, abat, and how even the most loyal party members began visiting churches again. Valery did not go back to Odessa. He had done all he could. He returned to his office, poured tea from a chipped enamel cup, and waited. He still came to work each day. He answered phones. He filed papers. But he no longer believed in the system that had shaped his life. Across Ukraine, similar realizations took hold. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was disillusionment, quiet and vast. It's like fog creeping in through the windows. In Lviv, store managers locked their shelves at night, not to protect food, but to hide the fact there was none. In Poltava, a meat distributor was caught selling potatoes as meat substitute. People laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter was all that remained. And in Kyiv, university students began writing anonymous leaflets. They called it silent hunger, a hunger that had no name, no article in Pravda, no speech from the Kremlin, just a growing sense that the machine had broken and no one could fix it. Local party leaders grew nervous. They sent updates to Moscow in protest, but in panic. They asked for direction, for new forms, for permission to improvise. But the answers never came. Or when they did, they contradicted each other. One official in Zaporizhia received 2 memos in the same week. One demanding that grain stocks be reserved for strategic industrial personnel, and another insisting all available wheat be redirected to public school cafeterias. Both were stamped with urgency. Neither was clear. The deeper crisis, it turned out, was not grain. It was trust. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had trained its people to believe in the central plan. Even when it failed, it was still the plan. But now the plan was missing, or worse, irrelevant. And with each week, the grain sat in Odessa, rotting slightly. More, a truth became inescapable. The center could no longer hold. The factories still worked. The railways, at least on paper, still ran. But coordination had died, not from sabotage or rebellion, but from exhaustion. The glue of obedience had dried up, and without it, every ministry, every depot, every warehouse simply looked after itself. In Odessa, the port began quietly selling some of the grain to private buyers, small shipments, cash only, no records, few tons at a time, loaded onto trucks at night. It was illegal, of course, but also inevitable. The administrators were not traitors. They were cold, hungry, and unpaid. Some of that grain made its way north. Not to the collective farms, but to black market stalls in Kyiv and Dnipro. A 10-kilo sack of Canadian flour could now buy you 3 months of firewood, or a television, or silence. And still, no train arrived in Venetia. Valery stopped writing reports. He began spending more time at home, where his wife had taken up, knitting blankets to trade for eggs. His daughter, 19, had joined a youth reading circle not for books, but for underground newspapers. Evenings grew colder. The air was full of wood smoke and slow resignation. People no longer complained. They shrugged. They shared what they had. They lined their boots with newspaper. They turned off hallway lights to save electricity. And they stopped asking when the government would help, because they knew it wouldn't. In the end, the grain was never delivered, not through official channels. Spring arrived, and with it, a small domestic harvest. But it was not enough. The hunger had passed, but something else had settled in its place. A quiet fury. Not explosive, not dramatic, just a permanent understanding that the old world was ending. The Soviet Union hadn't fallen yet, but it had let go. And as Valery sat one night in March, listening to the silence beyond his window, he thought of the grain still sitting in those silos, never touched, never ordered, never acknowledged. He thought, what else is rotting in this country, simply because no one will move it. And that question would not leave him asterisk by the time the grain in Odessa had grown a layer of mildew thick enough to resemble snow. It was no longer grain. It was evidence of a state that still printed quotas, wrote memos, issued plans, but could no longer carry them out. In the spring of 1991, an audit team was dispatched from Kyiv. The audit wasn't about hunger. It was about accounting. Some department in Moscow wanted to know why the grain from Canada hadn't been used. They asked for weight certificates, loading schedules, destination logs, the paperwork. Always the paperwork, but the paperwork was gone. In Odessa, the administrators, once proud men with rows of medals pinned to padded coats, now kept their offices dark during the day. They pretended the power had failed. They pretended their phones didn't work. Some had begun selling old office chairs to passing merchants. Others simply didn't return after lunch. The audit team found silos half full. Others had been quietly emptied. Where the grain had gone, no one could say, or would say. The paper trail ended in February. One of the auditors, a pale man from Kyiv named Boris, quietly asked a port guard why no trains had come. The guard, a former soldier with a gray mustache and kind eyes, answered, "No one told us to open the gates." It was that simple. No orders, no action. In a country trained to follow command, nothing happened without a signature. But the people who signed things had gone quiet, or missing, or irrelevant. The audit report, when submitted, was filled with passive sentences. It was observed that no movement of grain occurred. It is unclear where responsibility for transfer lies. No irregularities were officially documented, but discrepancies exist. In other words, nothing could be proven and no one could be blamed in Venetia. Valery read a copy of the report quietly sent to him by an old colleague in Kyiv. He read it twice, not because he expected clarity, but because he still wanted to believe there was order in the words. He folded the paper, lit a match, and burned it in the kitchen sink. He no longer needed evidence. He had lived through the consequence, and yet life continued. By summer, the shortages had become normalized. Every home had a system. Some kept jars of boiled wheat. Others learned to grow vegetables in stairwells. Women formed trading circles, sugar for soap, matches for aspirin, knitting for cooking oil. The underground market was not criminal. It was survival. Even the party officials participated. Quietly, one man traded an old Soviet flag for a crate of canned fish. Another swapped a bust of pea linen for firewood. Symbols were no longer sacred. Only warmth and calories mattered. And while the government still broadcast speeches about strength and solidarity, most radios were tuned to static or silence. It wasn't rebellion, it was abandonment. A soft, nationwide shrugged. The grain had been a symptom, not the disease. Across the Soviet Union, there were thousands of similar stories. Trains that didn't run, medications that never arrived, schools that taught out of books printed 2 decades earlier, cities that waited for pensions that were never transferred. It was a quiet failure, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that unravels a country from the inside out. Valery kept showing up to work. So did others, out of habit, out of pride. But the meaning had drained from the routine. He filled out forms that no one read, attended meetings where no one listened. Until one day in August, his supervisor simply didn't show up. No announcement, no letter, just an empty chair. It was the same in offices across the republics. People disappeared into early retirement, into gardening, into nothingness, and no one replaced them by the end of 1991. The Soviet Union still existed, technically. It had borders, leaders, a flag, but it no longer moved. It was like an enormous train, long derailed, that it kept moving out of momentum alone. And now, even the momentum was gone. In December of that year, Gorbachev resigned. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, and, for most people, the moment felt anticlimactic, not because they didn't care, but because the country had ended. Long before that, it ended when the phones stopped ringing, when the trucks stopped arriving, when the silos were full. But no one opened the gates. In the final days of 1991, Valery walked past a bakery in Venezia. There was no bread, but someone had drawn a cartoon in the window, a single loaf of rye, wearing a crown, with the words, "Still waiting for grain." People chuckled and walked on. History did not fall that winter. It simply faded. In reports, silos, in the quiet ache of waiting too long for something that never came. The Soviet Union ended not with tanks or revolution, but with an unanswered form, and a shipment of wheat no one claimed. And when the walls finally crumbled, many people had already learned to live without them. Asterisk in the grand theater of Soviet politics. Silence was often more dangerous than speech. For decades, the men who rose through the ranks of the Communist Party were expected to master the art of loyalty, unwavering, public, and precise. Disagreements were whispered, if at all, behind closed doors, masked in euphemisms and submerged in committee jargon. Too openly dissent, especially from within, was too risk erasure. And yet, in December 1990, a tall, tired man with silver hair stood before the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and did the unthinkable. He said, "No, Edward Shevardnadze, think the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He simply read from a sheet of paper with the calmness of a teacher reciting a lesson that no one had dared include in the curriculum. I am stepping down," he said. "Dictatorship is coming." And then he left. No one applauded. No one moved. The room, filled with men in gray suits and gray expressions, sat frozen in the glow of chandeliers in disbelief. Because this was not how the Soviet story was supposed to go. Ministers did not resign. They were reassigned or removed, or quietly faded into advisory roles. But Shevardnadze had left by choice, and his choice exposed something brittle beneath the surface. He was not a revolutionary. He had risen through the system like so many others, beginning in the provincial politics of Georgia, earning his stripes not by defying the machine, but by mastering it. He had served loyally under Gorbachev, even helping to usher in the reforms of perestroika and glasnost. In the West, he was seen as the affable face of Soviet diplomacy, the man who brokered arms deals, shook hands with Americans, and smiled in photographs. But inside the party, Shevardnadze was increasingly isolated. The reforms he had once championed were unraveling. The old guard, threatened by decentralization and openness, was reasserting control. Hardliners whispered about order, tradition, and the need for discipline. In smoky rooms, beneath red banners, they spoke of stability, of making the Union strong again, and Shevardnadze saw it coming. Not a coup, not a sudden collapse, but a return to repression. Asterisk. In private, he had begun warning colleagues that glasnost was being gutted, that censorship was creeping back into state television, that the KGB had resumed tapping reformist phones. But his warnings were dismissed as alarmist. He had served long enough to know what came next, and so he left not in protest, but in mourning. His resignation wasn't a call to arms. It was an obituary for the dream that the Soviet Union could change from within. In the months leading up to his decision, Shevardnadze had watched as regional leaders began asserting independence. In Lithuania, in Georgia, in Estonia local, parliaments passed laws declaring supremacy over Moscow. Gorbachev tried to balance reform with control, but the center was hollowing within the foreign ministry. Things had grown stranger. Meetings went unattended. Memos arrived later, not at all. Budgetary allocations were frozen without explanation. And then came the rumors that elements within the military were drawing up contingency plans, that KGB loyalists were holding late-night sessions without reporting them, that old party figures long sidelined were returning to favored positions. The air in the Kremlin grew heavy. In one meeting, Shevardnadze reportedly asked a fellow minister, "Do you feel the shadow growing?" The man replied, "It's just winter." But Shevardnadze knew it was more than that. And when the moment came, he didn't warn anyone. He didn't leak his decision. He simply walked into the chamber, read his resignation aloud, and walked away. Outside, the snow was falling. Inside the hall, no one followed him. For the first time in decades, a high-ranking Soviet official had rejected the system without fleeing it, without betraying it, without turning to the West. He had simply stopped believing. His statement, "Dictatorship is coming," echoed beyond the walls of the Supreme Soviet. It was printed in small fonts on the back pages of official newspapers. Western journalists ran the story with urgency, but inside the USSR, it passed quietly. No investigations were launched, no arrests, no denial from the Kremlin, just a cold silence, because everyone knew he was right. In Tbilisi, where Shevardnadze had once been first secretary, people gathered in cafes and kitchens, whispering his name. Some called him a hero, others a coward, keyed, but most understood what he had done. He had said what many feared to say, that reform had failed. And the hardliners were circling. Gorbachev made no public condemnation. He merely said he regretted the resignation. Privately, he was said to be furious, but also paralyzed. The dream they had once shared was unraveling. Not from bullets or coups, but from entropy. In the months after Shevardnadze's departure, the machinery of government grew slower. More decrees went unheeded. More reports went unread. Regional leaders took bolder steps, and in the halls of power, no one talked about the resignation anymore, because to speak of it was to admit that someone had seen the end coming and left before the collapse. But what does it mean when the one who leaves is the last one who believed? What remains in a system when even its architects begin walking away? Asterisk, he was gone, but his words remained in the months after Edward Shevardnadze's resignation. Those 5 words, "Dictatorship is coming," drifted through Soviet offices like a whisper carried on dust. They were not repeated in meetings, not printed on banners, but they surfaced in glances, in pauses, in the silences between colleagues who used to speak more freely. The Soviet Union, the start of 1991, was not yet dead, but it had started flinching at its own reflection. Inside the Kremlin, Gorbachev tried to press forward. He issued statements of reassurance. He reminded the public that reforms were still underway. He emphasized dialogue, but without Shevardnadze beside him, the tone shifted. What had once sounded like collective reform now felt solitary, defensive, hesitant. Those who remained in the leadership were not all hardliners, but they were quieter. And the ones who were hardliners, they were beginning to sharpen their tools. Shevardnadze, meanwhile, had returned to Georgia, not in disgrace, but in retreat. He kept a low profile, appearing at quiet civic events, avoiding interviews, resisting invitations to speak on television. He knew the weight of his gesture. He had not fled. He had not defected. He had simply stopped cooperating with the system he believed was circling back to repression. But what had he seen exactly that made him leave? Historians would later piece together clues. Throughout 1990, Shevardnadze had grown increasingly alarmed by reports from within the KGB. Not official reports, those were always polished, indistinct, but personal messages, warnings, whispers. People he trusted within the Foreign Service had started disappearing from key meetings. Invitations to policy discussions were rescinded at the last minute. Gorbachev's inner circle was narrowing, and the voices left inside were becoming more disciplined, more cautious. There was one meeting, never officially recorded, where a senior military commander reportedly suggested a reform pause, a brief halt on decentralization, just to restore order, just until the Union stabilized. It was, in essence, a test, and Shevardnadze did not pass it. He was not a firebrand. He was not a protester, but he had seen the script before. He had watched what happened in Prague in 1968, in Afghanistan in 1979, in Georgia in 1989. When Soviet troops cracked down on peaceful demonstrators with gas and spades in the quiet permission of silence, in that memory of blood washing across the steps of Tbilisi's parliament, he saw the future. He knew what came next. When the party grew afraid, it didn't shout, it tightened. And so, as 1991 began, the tightening grew visible. Press freedoms that had blossomed in 1989 were now clipped. A major editor of a reformist newspaper was dismissed without notice. Radio stations in the Baltic republics reported mysterious outages. One by one, open forums in universities were shut down, not by police, but by bureaucratic delays in missing permits. This was the Soviet method, not loud crackdowns, but paper ones. The tools of control were old and familiar. The difference was, now, people noticed, even within the foreign ministry, the tone shifted. Requests for diplomatic initiatives like cultural exchanges or environmental partnerships were left pending for weeks. Resources for foreign travel were slashed. Overseas posts were instructed to prioritize ideological consistency. That phrase struck Shevardnadze like a bell. It had been buried for years, and now it rang again. He attempted one last internal intervention, a memorandum to Gorbachev, written not in fear, but frustration. It detailed his concerns, the rollback of reform, the return of familiar shadows, the risks of alienating regional republics. Gorbachev never replied, not with a letter, not with a phone call, just silence. And for Shevardnadze, that silence said everything. Not that Gorbachev agreed, but that he could no longer act. And when a leader cannot act, the machinery below him chooses its own path. It was shortly after this silence that Shevardnadze decided to leave, not because he had lost hope entirely, but because staying would make him complicit. The train was accelerating in the wrong direction, and he knew from history how many passengers would pretend not to notice until the brakes failed. The true impact of his resignation was not felt in Moscow. It was felt in the republics, because when Shevardnadze left, he proved something that had not been clear before. That departure was possible. You didn't have to betray the country. You didn't have to immigrate. You could just stop. And one by one, others began to follow, not high-ranking ministers, but mayors, regional directors, school officials. They quietly left their posts. They handed off keys. They went home. The machine still ran, but now with fewer parts. In Lithuania, Parliament declared independence. In Latvia, border guards stopped wearing Soviet uniforms. In Georgia, a new political party named itself after the phrase, "We will not wait." And in Moscow, the silence deepened, because once a resignation begins to echo, the walls start to shake. By June of 1991, Shevardnadze was largely forgotten in official speeches. Gorbachev rarely mentioned him, but among the public, his words, "dictatorship is coming," were printed in samizdat leaflets, scrawled on bathroom walls in universities, whispered during lectures. No one knew what kind of dictatorship he meant, but they knew what kind of quiet he feared, and they had begun to hear it themselves. But what happens to a system when the people inside it stop believing even as they remain? What happens when the silence is not just from above, but from within? Asterisk. The Soviet Union had always run on ritual. Meetings began with applause. Reports ended with slogans. Celebrations marked achievements that hadn't occurred, and disasters were reclassified as necessary adjustments. It was a system that required belief not just in ideology, but in process. To question was to threaten the order. To pause was to betray momentum. And then one day, a man named Edward Shevardnadze paused, and the machine flinched. Months after his resignation, the effects were still rippling not loudly, but visibly. Where once party discipline had enforced unity, there now emerged quiet variations, not rebellion. Not yet, but improvisation, flexibility, and in some corners, even refusal. Asterisk. Shevardnadze had done what no one else at his level had dared. He walked away not out of scandal, but out of conscience, and it set a precedent. Inside ministries, meetings grew shorter. Attendance was no longer enforced with the same vigor. In regional offices, administrators began expressing doubt carefully, indirectly. They spoke of unclear directives, challenges in coordination, of increased local initiative. In Soviet language, these were dangerous phrases, but now they floated freely because someone had said no and survived. In late summer of 1991, the hardliners finally acted. They launched a Vorkuta, very dictatorship Shevardnadze had warned about. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Leaders were arrested. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest in Crimea. But it was too late. The people, weary of silence and shadow, came into the streets, and for 3 days, the world watched as Soviet citizens surrounded the White House in Moscow with their bodies. Some climbed tanks. Others held signs. Some just stood quietly, believing that something, anything other than a return to fear was worth defending. The coup collapsed. The hardliners failed. But by then, the Union had already begun disintegrating. Shevardnadze in Georgia watched the events unfold with quiet anguish. He had not led the resistance. He had not returned. But in his own way, he had cleared a path, a narrow one, a fragile one, but a path. And what remained was the aftermath of disbelief. Because what happens to a system when even its most loyal servants step away? What happens when the ranks of believers grow thinner, not from exile or execution, but from disillusionment? The final days of 1991, Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the USSR. No tanks fired. No crowds cheered. It was an administrative ending, a treaty, a transfer, a final line drawn between republics that had once shared slogans. In Edward Shevardnadze, he returned to public life in Georgia, not as a Soviet minister, but as a leader of a nation rediscovering itself. His legacy remained complex. Some saw him as a reformer who acted too late, others as a statesman who recognized the end before it arrived. But in the context of Soviet collapse, his resignation remained a landmark because it asked a question no one had wanted to hear. What if the system could not be reformed? What if, instead of pushing forward, the only moral action was to stop? And, in stopping, what would happen if others followed? Not with fire, not with revolution, but with fatigue, with conscience, with a quiet departure. The kind that says, I will no longer carry this weight for you, in a state built on collective belief. The moment belief then sabens slightly, the walls begin to bend, and by the time they fall, the silence has already filled the room. Asterisk, it began with salt. Not meat, not milk. Those had vanished long ago. But salt. Salt had always been there. Small, unglamorous blue packets. Cheap, unnoticed. It sat on the shelves like a promise, like a relic of better days. Even when the sausages disappeared, when the butter was locked behind glass. The salt remained until one Thursday morning in January 1991. It didn't on Ulitsa Tverskaya, one of the oldest shops in central Moscow, opened at 8 a.m. to a line that had formed 3 hours earlier. Wrapped in scarves, boots stiff with snow, dozens of shoppers shuffled in and stopped. The shelves were empty, not sparse, not light, empty, not even pickles, not even vinegar, not even those pale loaves of gray bread stacked like bricks. Just us, and silence. A single sign was taped to the glass. No deliveries expected this week. Please understand. By noon, the sign was gone. Someone had taken it. By evening, the windows were dark, and this was not an isolated case. It had been building for months. Across Moscow's districts, from the grand Soviet-era domes to the anonymous concrete micro-districts, the same pattern unfolded. First, the variety disappeared. Then the essentials. Then the replacements for the essentials. Then the illusion. In 1990, shortages were common. In 1991, they became policy. The government issued ration books again. Small, square, and beige, inked with monthly quotas. 500 grams of sugar, 250 grams of butter, 1 chicken per household per month, okay, if available. If, and if not, people queued anyway, because queues were no longer just about food, okay? They were information. If you saw one, you stood in it. You didn't ask what was at the front. You simply hoped it was anything worth eating or trading. A queue meant a rumor, and a rumor meant possibility. One man in Sokolniki stood in line for 6 hours. He left with 2 bars of soap and a tin of cod liver. He didn't eat fish, but he smiled because someone else might. There was no panic, not yet, just an eerie sense that things had stopped pretending to work. The managers of the stores, once confident, bureaucratic fixtures of Soviet life, now avoided eye contact. They stood behind empty counters, rearranging air. They made notes in ledgers with no numbers to add. They offered shrugs. Delivery hasn't come. Maybe next week. Try the kiosk near Prospect Mira. But there were no deliveries. Really? Just partial trucks. Sometimes rerouted. Sometimes intercepted. Often simply delayed by confusion, because the central distribution that worked the nervous system of Soviet supply was fraying. Factories still produced goods, but the roads were clogged. The trains derailed more frequently. Fuel shortages stalled. Entire shipments. And above it all, the ministry suffocating under contradictions issued new directives weekly. Ration first, deregulate second, privatize third, and nationalize again if necessary. The shopkeepers didn't know who to listen to, so they waited, and the people did the same. In their apartments, they boiled cabbage, sometimes with onions if they were lucky, in kitchens lit by single bulbs. They scraped burned crusts from bottom of a pot porridge. Children grew quieter. Families with connections traded favors for fruit. Others most simply adapted. It wasn't starvation, but it was a kind of erasure. A soft, daily humiliation. In schools, teachers skipped lunch. In hospitals, nurses brought their own supplies. In factories, workers punched time cards and sat at empty stations, 'cause the materials had stopped coming, and still the shelves stayed bare. Sometimes a truck would arrive, an unannounced miracle, bread or oil or hard candies wrapped in wax paper, and within minutes the news would spread by whispers, by footsteps, by instinct. Lines would form like rivers breaking through snowdrifts. People of every age, every rank, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold. One night, in the freezing dark, a woman fainted in line for carrots. She had been waiting 5 hours. Another woman took her place. No one spoke, because what was there to say? On Soviet television, the coverage remained unchanged. Leaders discussed economic targets, military budgets, industrial output, the word crisis was never spoken. Even the news anchors looked thinner. Their suits hung looser, their smiles strained behind them. The nation drifted. Some citizens began traveling to satellite republics Armenia, to Georgia, the Baltics, seeking goods that had somehow not yet vanished. But even those markets were thinning, and border guards now watched more closely. In the black market, it flourished, not in shadows, but in broad daylight, on corners, in alleys, on stairwells. Vendors with polished matches, Hungarian toothpaste, Ukrainian cigarettes, imported sugar, cans of Cuban condensed milk, all at prices that drained a month's wages. The government warned against it, issued statements, arrested a few sellers. Even the arresting officers often carried black market lighters in their coat pockets, because everyone was participating, even the officials, even the ones who wrote the rules. And so, shelves remained empty, not just of food, but of pretense, because the system had run out of stories to tell. And when the stories disappear, what fills the silence? Only the sound of boots on linoleum, only the sight of empty glass under flickering fluorescent light, only the quiet realization that the shelves were not being stocked because no one knew how anymore. But what does it do to a country when people wait in line, not for food, but for hope? What does it mean when absence becomes the norm? Asterisk. The ration book was not new for older citizens. Its return in 1991 was less a shock than a memory stirred from dust. A pocket-sized ledger bound in cheap glue. Its pages offered a printed illusion of order. Sugar, tea, flour, meat, soap, matches each with a box to be stamped. A box that said, "You are part of the system. You will get your share." But the stamp didn't always come. And sometimes the share didn't exist in a grocery on Leninsky Prospect. A clerk named Yelena handled the ration books every morning. She had worked the counter for 17 years. She still wore her white apron, still straightened the same shelves out of habit. But by 1991, she no longer believed the numbers. One Wednesday morning, a man came in with a ration book and a grimace. He was polite, quiet, just wanted his 250 grams of rice. Asterisk. Yelena looked at her ledger. The delivery hadn't come. Again, she glanced at the clock, then back at the man's hollowed eyes. Without speaking, she took a half bag of oats she had hidden under the counter left over from last weekend, slid it across. "No rice," she whispered. "But this cooks softer." He nodded, took the oats. No words, just a slight bow of the head, the kind of thank you older men in the USSR gave when they didn't have the strength to say more. Outside the store, the line stretched around the block. Most had brought books. Some hadn't. It didn't matter. The ink inside meant less with each passing week. What mattered was who you knew, what you heard, what you were willing to trade. Asterisk. The ration book had become a ritual, not a guarantee. And that transformation, subtle as it was, marked something irreversible. Because in Soviet life, symbols held power. The red flag, the slogans, the May Day parades all were performative. Yes, but also binding. They told people the system is still intact. The rhythm continues. But empty shelves broke that rhythm in the ration book. Once a promise of fairness, now reminded people of how uneven things had become in the stairwells of Moscow's apartment blocks. You could hear the gossip. He gets more because his cousin works in distribution. She always has, but she must have a second book. They're hiding food in the school kitchen. I know it. Some of it was true. Most wasn't. But truth mattered less than perception. And the perception was this: the system that once claimed to serve all now served some, quietly, unofficially, and the rest stood in line. Or they didn't. Some simply gave up. Elderly pensioners skipped their turns. Mothers stayed home, relying on neighbors. A few turned their attention to homegrown remedies, making kvass from stale bread, preserving beets in buckets, drying apples on windowsills. The city adapted. Balconies became greenhouses. Public parks became potato patches. In one corner of Gorky Park, a man staked out a tiny plot and grew onions. No one stopped him. Police officers passed, looked, and walked on. They, too, had ration books. And they, too, found nothing on the shelves. Meanwhile, official state broadcasts grew more. Detached. Economic restructuring, said one anchor, was progressing steadily. New supply chains were being reconsidered. Urban food shortages were not uncommon in transitional economies. And then the camera cut to a construction site. A new hotel rising near Red Square. Modern, promising, clean. But people didn't want hotels. They wanted oil, flour, tea, and they wanted answers no one could give in private. Members of the Moscow City Council debated whether to print new ration books. A fourth version, simplified. Some argued for expanding the categories to include basics like shoes or firewood. Others said fewer categories with lower expectations. One delegate suggested removing meat entirely. That way, won't have to explain why it's never available. There was laughter, but not humor, just fatigue in the streets. People began repurposing their old ration books. One woman used hers to teach her daughter numbers. Another turned the blank pages into a grocery list. Some were burned in stoves. They had become paper, just paper. And with that realization came something deeper. The understanding that perhaps this was not temporary, that perhaps the shelves would not be refilled, that the trucks were not simply delayed but missing, that the center, wherever it was, had stopped sending things. And if the shelves could remain empty, what else might vanish? Education, fuel, pensions, the state itself. It was no longer unthinkable. By late spring, citizens were improvising entire parallel economies. Bakeries that operated informally from basements, barter markets under highway, overpasses, truck drivers who rerouted goods in exchange for fuel, entire apartment buildings that shared a single weekly grocery run, pooling rubles like water in a leaking bucket. And as summer approached, even the ration book began to disappear. Some stores stopped asking for it. Others used it for show. Only the kiosks still pretended to honor it, but they had nothing to give. Yelena, the grocery clerk, kept hers in her apron pocket, not because she believed in it, but because she remembered what it once meant. I carry it, she told her neighbor one evening, like I carry my passport, just in case someone still believes. It matters. The neighbor nodded, didn't answer. They both stared out the window, down at the line, at the people standing in silence, holding bags, staring through glass at shelves that no longer even held dust. And in the stillness of that gaze, a question formed. If the shelves stay empty, and no one fills them, how long before the silence spreads further? How long before the shelves are not the only things left unstocked? Asterisk, by the end of 1991, Moscow was still a city of millions. The trams still ran most of the time, the factories still hummed, though many now produced goods no one collected. The newspapers were still printed, but they were thinner. The schools still opened, but the chalk was broken. The radio still played music, though sometimes it skipped or turned to static without warning. And the stores still stood, but they had stopped being stores. They were shape shells, really, not businesses, not even services, but rooms where transactions no longer occurred. Rooms where silence had taken up residence. People stopped going inside. There was no point. Some shopkeepers hung curtains across the display windows to keep the disappointment from becoming scenery. Others removed signage entirely. A few simply locked their doors and didn't return. leaving behind rows of dusty shelves like forgotten museum exhibits. History in progress, unannounced. There was a story told among Moscow's street sweepers in the fall of 1991 that a child had walked past a grocery with her grandmother, stopped, and pointed at the empty window. Was this where food used to live? She asked. And no one laughed, because it felt true, not just as a metaphor, but as a fact. Food had once lived here. In places, on shelves, in glass cases, behind tired clerks. It had been real. It had arrived. It had been bought, and now it didn't come anymore. The disappearance of supply became its own kind of presence. A lingering, echoing thing, not dramatic, not even tragic, just persistent. It's quiet, like the absence of a heartbeat you didn't notice, until the room grew to still. Economists would later describe this period in charts: production dips, consumption ratios, inflation curves, but in the stairwells of Moscow, it was simpler than that. It was soap you couldn't find, matches you had to light twice, butter that came in gray bricks from a cousin's cousin in Kaluga, tea that tasted faintly of burlap. It was the price of absence becoming a lifestyle. And yet life went on. Weddings still happened. So did funerals. Children played. Old men told stories. The city moved, but slower, like a clock losing seconds each day. A train on rusted rails, still in motion only because gravity hadn't caught up yet. And within that motion, people adapted. Because people always do in a 10-story building near the Toganskaya metro station. A woman named Galina began cooking soup in batches and giving it away from her ground floor kitchen window. She asked for nothing in return. But her neighbors started bringing her things anyway. Half bags of salt, tins of canned fruit, broken lighters. It wasn't charity, it was circulation. A new kind of supply, one based not on quotas or rubles or ministries, but memory. Memory of a time when the shelves were full, yes, but also of something older. A time before the shelves, before the supermarkets, when food came from people, not systems. Because in the collapse of the central plan, something older emerged, not better, not more efficient, more human. Mistrust turned slowly into mutual necessity. Neighbors began knocking again, not to borrow sugar, but to ask if anyone had heard about flour arriving at the rail station. Children delivered notes across buildings. Women formed new barter circles. Men fixed broken radios in exchange for eggs, and the city bent. It did not fall. It simply reshaped itself round absence. A journalist from Leningrad visiting Moscow in December wrote a quiet line in her notebook. The shelves are empty, but the hands are full again of each other, of questions, of small kindnesses. It would never be printed, but it was remembered. Meanwhile, the government issued one last set of numbers. Industrial output had dropped 13%. Meat availability had dropped 20%. Currency, inflation, was projected to rise 350% in the next quarter. And, in the bottom of the report, under food distribution forecasts, there was a single sentence: urban availability remains inconsistent across central districts. A phrase so vague it bordered on poetry, and yet, somehow, more honest than usual, because urban availability did not exist. Not anymore. What existed was survival, in fragments, in handshakes, in whispered news of a bread truck spotted in the outskirts, in soup from Galina's kitchen window, in silence, and in the memory of shelves once full now, standing like ghosts in the corners of people's lives. It was not the end of hunger. It was the end of belief that anyone else was still managing it. And when the people stop believing that supply is coming, when they stop believing in shelves, in quotas, in stamps, they begin to write their own systems, not with laws, but with waiting, and with the long, slow, steady realization. The Soviet Union had not fed them for some time. They had only just noticed. Asterisk, Vorkuta is not near anything. It lies past the Arctic Circle, in the far north of the Komi Republic, closer to the tundra than to Moscow, surrounded by silence, snow, and the slow, drifting breath of a land that forgets to thaw. The train takes days to reach it, and even then, only if it runs in the early 1990s. The tracks to Vorkuta grew colder. Fewer shipments arrived, fewer papers were signed. Fewer officials remembered the miners who lived there, and the miners remembered that. They remembered everything. Vorkuta had always been a place of memory. Its cold beds had been opened by prisoners, men and women in striped uniforms, forced to dig under Stalin's gaze. Labor camps lined the region like broken teeth in the permafrost. Even in 1991, when the USSR had supposedly softened, those ghosts remained. Not in chains, but in absence. Asterisk. The miners of Vorkuta were not dissidents or rebels. Soviet citizens, men in heavy coats who woke in the dark, descended into deeper dark, and returned long after the sun had disappeared. They were quiet, steady, and cold, but even they had limits. In early February 1991, the coal stopped moving. The trains didn't come, not for days, then weeks. The storage bins filled, then overflowed, then sat untouched. Still, the miners kept mining for a time because that's what they did. But then came the moment, not dramatic, not violent, when someone simply said, "No more." The man's name was Anatoly, a foreman, 52 years old, had worked in shaft for 3 decades. That morning, he sat on a bench outside the pit, removed his helmet, and waited. His crew followed suit. One by one, boots stopped thudding into the earth. Slabs were turned off. The silence began, and in Vorkuta, silence was a form of protest, not because anyone would hear it, but because it was the only tool left. The wages hadn't been paid in 3 months. The food shipments were irregular. The heating oil was diluted, and Moscow hadn't replied to the last 6 telegrams. So the miners did the one thing that could not be ignored. They stopped going down. Word spread quickly, not just through Vorkuta, but across the other Arctic towns. Inkta, Ukta, Pechora, cities built on coal, carved into the ice by willpower and steel rations. Their miners joined the silence. It was not a strike in the Western sense. There were no signs, no chants, just idle elevators, empty shafts, men standing outside in parkas, holding 10 cups of tea that froze around the edges. A camera crew from the local TV station came to record the event. They found nothing, just men standing, and behind them, mountains of unsent coal. When asked what they wanted, Anatoly said, "We want to be remembered." The Ministry of Energy issued a brief statement. Supplies were delayed due to logistical recalibration. The labor stoppage was unofficial and unnecessary. Talks would resume when appropriate. But no one came, because no one knew what to say anymore. And in Vorkuta, the silence deepened. The wives of the miners, many of whom worked in the sorting yards or the community canteens, kept the town alive. They baked bread in communal ovens, organized supply trades with nearby settlements, sent letters to the Oblast Center. Some walked 3 hours to find a telephone that still worked. They were answered with humming tones, then silence. One woman, Galina Petrovna, handwrote 127 copies of a petition and mailed them to ministries across the USSR. Each one included a list of the families in her district, their ages, their food stock, and the temperature in their flats. -22 degrees Celsius indoors. She received 4 replies. All were form letters. One addressed her as Comrade Male Citizen. That letter was burned in the town square, not as a rebellion, but as punctuation, because by now, Vorkuta had realized something essential. it was alone. The government would not fix this. The coal would not be collected. The wages would not arrive. And the country seemed was no longer looking north. The strike continued, not in waves, but in wait, a slow, immovable decision, and Moscow preoccupied with shortages, with politics, with the unraveling of everything let it happen. Later, historians would mark it as one of the quietest labor strikes in Soviet history. No arrests, no resolution. It's a cold town on the edge of the map, choosing stillness over obedience. But what does it mean when the most loyal workers, ones who built the empire's warmth, decide not to dig? What happens when the cold stops being fought and becomes the answer? Asterisk, by mid-February 1991, Vorkuta was a city in waiting, not waiting for spring that wouldn't come for months, not waiting for trains that hope had dissolved. They were waiting, instead, for a response, any response, from Moscow, from the ministry, from someone who still believed the North was part of the plan. No one came. The mines remained idle, and in the absence of coal, the city began to collapse inwards. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a lung forgetting to expand. The heating plants, still burning reserves, began rationing warmth. Apartment blocks were heated in shifts, 5 hours on, 10 hours off. Schools operated with coats on. The ink in pens froze. Pipes cracked open like eggshells. Children slept in hats and mittens under piles of sweaters. Yet still, the miners refused to return to the shafts, because to return would be to forget the silence. And they had learned something from the silence. They had learned that no one was coming. One morning, a man named Oleg climbed the rusted tower above shaft 2 and hung a banner. It was a white sheet, torn at the edges, painted in charcoal. "We do not dig for ghosts." The message spread quickly, photocopied in black and white and pinned to community boards. It was never explained, but everyone understood. They weren't just striking for wages anymore. They were striking for recognition. Coal had made Vorkuta matter. Now the coal sat untouched, and no one seemed to care. Was that what they had been? Useful, but never seen? Back in Moscow, there were meetings about the northern strikes. Minutes were taken. Recommendations drafted, but the machinery of decision-making had grown sluggish. One memo recommended increasing bread shipments to the Arctic regions. Another recommended disbanding unprofitable shafts. Neither was acted on in the meantime. The people of Vorkuta made their own adjustments. One factory converted its motor parts line to make wood stoves from scrap metal. Locals gathered fallen timber from the outskirts of town, stacking it in alleyways. A new black market emerged, not for luxury goods, but for firewood, coal dust, and kerosene-touched children began to carry wood to school instead of books. The library stopped lending. It had been converted into a relief center. Galina Petrovna, the same woman who had sent the petitions, now ran a soup kitchen out of the town's cultural center. Her recipes were plain turnips, beets, barley, but people came, tana for taste, but for warmth. The meals were pay what you can, most paid in kind. Spare boots, thread, cans of fish that had sat untouched since 1987. The local television station stopped broadcasting. It's not from censorship. There was nothing to censor, but from power shortages. For 3 hours a day, the screen flickered with soft snow. And then silence. In that silence, a strange strength began to grow. The miners formed a committee, not political, not official, just 7 men who met in a shed behind the depot. They organized wood collections, bartered with nearby villages, and tracked the elderly in each apartment block to ensure no one froze unnoticed. One of them, a man named Vadim, kept a list of every miner who had not returned to work. He called it the Ledger of Refusal. At first, it was symbolic. Then it became something more, a record of names who chose dignity over routine. By March, There were over 800 names on the list, and still, no trains came. Rumors began to drift, infiltrated through visiting cousins, tattered newspapers, old radios that sometimes caught foreign frequencies. Lithuania had declared independence. Gorbachev was losing support. The ruble was collapsing. And in one report, whispered and then confirmed, was said that the Ministry of Coal had reclassified Vorkuta's mines as non-priority. Okay? That word, non-priority, was a kind of death sentence. No resources, no fuel, no plans, just slow abandonment. The miners didn't react with protest. They didn't march or break windows. They simply continued to not go underground. Their refusal had become a rhythm. One older miner, Yuri, put it this way: the shaft is still there, but doesn't call us anymore. Because in the Soviet system, work had once been identity, purpose, a contract between state and citizen. You give us your sweat, and we will give you meaning. But what happens when the meaning disappears? What happens when your labor is no longer requests, just expected? When your breath freezes in your beard and no one notices? In Vorkuta, they answered that question with stillness. They didn't revolt. They endured. They cooked, shared, waited, recorded, kept each other alive. It was not dramatic, but it was resistance. And in that resistance, a question was quietly born. If coal built the Union's warmth, what does it mean when even the coal is abandoned? Asterisk spring never really comes to Vorkuta, not in the way it does to the rest of Russia. Snow melts in slow apologies. Puddles linger where roads once were. The daylight lasts longer, but the cold stays buried in the walls. April feels like February with longer shadows. In 1991, spring arrived, but the heat didn't. The central boilers had been rationed into uselessness. What little fuel remained was needed for the hospital, the bakery, and the maintenance depot. Residential buildings were left to the whims of firewood, coal dust, and community stoves built from salvaged bricks. Inside the buildings, life compressed into corners. Families moved mattresses into kitchens. Doors stayed closed. Windows remained taped. Children slept beneath rugs. And the coal stayed where it was, below the earth, untouched. No one came to restart the shafts. No one issued new quotas. No one asked why an entire city had stopped producing. Because, by now, everyone knew why. In May, a man from Moscow did visit. His name was Alexander, an undersecretary from a mid-level ministry, recently reassigned from another role. He wore a coat that had once belonged to someone higher ranked. He arrived by plane, not by train, the only one scheduled that week. He met with the miners' committee, sat stiffly on a wooden bench, took notes on a pad he never looked at again, promised nothing, admitted even less. One miner, Vadim, handed him a copy of the Ledger of Refusal. Asterisk. Alexander held it like a foreign object. These are the men, Vadim said. They remember when work meant something. Alexander nodded. We will take this seriously. He flew back to Moscow the next morning. The ledger stayed behind. That was the last official visit. No follow-up letters came. No funds, no fuel, no instructions. Just another season folding into silence. And in that silence, Vorkuta changed. The mines were still, their deep, dark veins beneath the tundra, but they had become memory. The miners still existed, but they no longer called themselves that. They were builders now, carpenters, fixers, teachers, wood gatherers, soup stirrers, organizers. The labels of the state had dissolved. What remained was function and survival. The town shifted around new rituals. Galina's soup kitchen grew larger. It began hosting lessons for children in the afternoon math, taught beside bowls of buckwheat. A retired electrician wired the main square with salvaged batteries to power a single yellow light at night. It was dim, but it glowed. An apartment building became a trading post. Another became a medical center. No decrees were issued. No meetings were held. Vorkuta simply learned to replace what was lost. The last official paychecks arrived in June. They were worth little. By then, rubles had lost half their value in the market. Many were never even collected. They sat in envelopes, unopened, behind empty windows. People no longer asked for salaries. They asked for flour, for boots, or a ride to Ingta. And the stories began stories not of ideology or socialism or revolution, but of adaptation, of stoves built from car doors, of a pig traded for a case of matches, of a train conductor who rode to Syktyvkar alone, to bring back medicine. These stories spread, not like propaganda, but like warmth, and warmth by then was the most radical thing you could offer. In July, an old man named Stepan finally entered shaft 1 again. Not to mine, to remember. He descended with a flashlight, slowly, carefully, touched the metal rails, ran his hand along the walls, listened to the air. It was still full of cold, still full of what once made the Union powerful. But now it was just rock, cold, quiet, and unclaimed. When he returned, he told the others, "It's still down there." They nodded, but no one followed him back in, because something had shifted. The coal no longer called. The ground no longer mattered. The state that once demanded every ounce of strength had forgotten how to even ask, and in that forgetting, Vorkuta became something new. Not rebellious, not broken, just free. It was a freedom forged not by politics, but by absence. A freedom born from disconnection. Not the kind that marches. The kind that grows when no one tells you who you are anymore. The town still stood. The people still lived. The mines still yawned in the dark. But the coal stayed where it was. And the hands that once dug, it had found other things to hold. Asterisk. There was a time not long ago when the ruble meant something. Not because it was strong, not because it could be freely exchanged or held value abroad, but because it structured life. It bought bread, it paid wages. It showed up as numbers on ration books and bank slips. Even in a closed system, the ruble was the link between labor and survival. And then, quote, suddenly, it wasn't. By 1991, people in Moscow could no longer say exactly what a ruble was worth. The state still printed it. Factories still paid it. Shops still demanded it. But no one trusted it because it no longer behaved like money. One day, it bought 4 kilos of potatoes. The next, 2. By the end of the month, none. Inflation wasn't a number anymore. It was a sensation. You could feel it in your pockets, their lightness. In your wallet, their irrelevance. Etch. In your hands, as you handed over 5 crisp bills and received a single crust of black bread in return. The ruble had become the most visible symptom of a system collapsing in plain sight, and like most collapses, started quietly. In late 1990, the government issued new banknotes. They were pastel-colored, thinner than before, bore images that were meant to inspire confidence. Lenin, the Kremlin, old monuments of Soviet progress. But no one felt inspired, because prices were rising and supply was falling, and the numbers printed on those pastel bills no longer matched what they could purchase. In Novosibirsk, a shopkeeper replaced price tags every other morning. Butter went from 4 rubles to 9 in a week. A bag of flour from 6 to 13. A small bottle of sunflower oil reached 25. People didn't complain. They just blinked, adjusted, queued longer, and bought less. Banks placed limits on cash withdrawals. Then they lowered them again. By spring 1991, you could wait 2 hours in line to receive 50 rubles, barely enough to purchase eggs and soap. Either were available. And yet, wages still arrived. On paper, factories paid employees. Ministries signed off on salaries. But it was a ritual, a performance with no audience, because the ruble in your account could not get you meat, or boots, or firewood, okay? And so, people began to improvise. Barter bloomed louder, faster, more structured than ever before. A mechanic traded tire patches for cheese. A teacher gave private math lessons in exchange for fish. One woman, in Perm, kept a small sign in her apartment stairwell: "I will knit socks for aspirin." No one called it a parallel economy. It was the only economy in the ruble. It became the thing you held in your hand while doing something else. In rural markets, prices were quoted in cigarettes or soap bars. In urban ones, people began asking, "How much in eggs?" It was not a rejection of money. It was a correction, a search for value, because value, once determined from above, now had to be discovered on the street. The government attempted reforms. It lifted price controls. It ejected currency. It blamed speculation. But speculation was not the problem. It was the absence of trust. When people no longer believed that the number printed on a bill reflected anything real, they stopped using the number. Not in defiance, but in practicality. And once practicality replaces belief, money becomes paper. In August of 1991, a man in Leningrad brought a briefcase full of rubles to a small grocery, hoping to stock up before prices rose again. The clerk stared at the case. "I can give you matches," she said, "and canned mushrooms. That's all you can carry." The man left with 12 tins and 2 boxes of matches. He left the briefcase behind because no one wanted the paper anymore. And yet, the banks continued. The presses continued. The presses rolled on. And the country, still calling itself the USSR, kept producing a currency that no longer meant anything to the people it was meant to serve. Some tried to preserve their savings. They purchased durable goods coats, pots, boots. They bought frozen chickens in bulk when available. They converted rubles into bricks, into bags of flour, into cement blocks, anything that could hold weight. And when they ran out of things to convert into, they waited, because no one knew what would happen next. Would a new currency come? Would the ruble recover? Would the state simply stop printing? People asked each other these questions in kitchens, in factories, on buses. No one knew. Even the economists were guessing. A few dissident publications ran the same headline, week after week. What is the ruble, really? Some said it was a symbol of loyalty. Others called it a ghost. And some simply laughed, because when the price of potatoes changes twice between sunrise and sunset, what else is there to do? But beneath the jokes, a deeper question remained. If the ruble no longer holds value, what does? What replaces belief when paper turns back into pulp? Asterisk. By autumn of 1991, no one counted change anymore at the kiosks on the edge of Moscow's metro stations. Coins were left in small bowls, uncollected, like broken buttons. Vendors waved away kopecks as if they were dust on a windowsill. Some shops placed handwritten signs over their tills. Change unavailable. Please round generously. But people were already rounding, not because they were generous, because the denominations had lost proportion. What was the difference between 3 rubles and 5, if either amount bought nothing? A loaf of rye cost 20 rubles in July. By September, it was 45. By October, 60. You could find one. It didn't feel like theft. It felt like forgetting what money meant. Teachers were among the first to stop using numbers. Not in the classroom there. They still taught mathematics, still wrote equations on chalkboards with frozen fingers. But outside school, in the market, in the pharmacy, in the line for kerosene, they no longer asked how much. They asked instead, what will you take for it? It wasn't negotiation, it was search. Search for a language where value still had roots. One teacher, Ludmila, traded 6 worn encyclopedias for a wool coat. The man who took them did not read Russian, but his daughter did. That was enough. In Novgorod, a librarian exchanged 1,200 rubles for a bucket of potatoes. She wrote it in her diary. 1,200 for potatoes. That's more than my monthly pension, but at least the bucket is mine. She underlined that sentence twice, because ownership still meant something. The ruble did not. Wages continued to be paid. Old habits die hard. But most workers stopped collecting them from the bank. Queues were long, withdrawal limits tight, and the banknotes felt like souvenirs from a country that no longer existed. One man collected his salary 864 rubles and used it to wallpaper his bathroom. It was cheaper than tiles. Asterisk. It became a local joke. And then a trend in St. Petersburg. One bar used rubles as coasters. Another gave out bills as napkins, printed with the phrase, clean enough to be worthless. But jokes, like coins, eventually lost their shine. For pensioners, the collapse of value was not just symbolic, it was hunger. Their savings, once enough for months, were now barely enough for bread. Government supplements were promised, but often delayed, and the black market did not operate on promises, so they adjusted. One woman began knitting doll clothes and selling them on train platforms. Another sold locks of her hair to wig makers. A man with a harmonica played outside the metro. Not for coins, people, and none, but for apples, boiled eggs, small favors. Some kept their rubles, not to use, but to remember. Neatly folded bills, pressed inside family albums, beside medals and ration cards. Monument to a time when money was not yet ridiculous, because that's what the ruble had become ridiculous. Not only weak, but strange. It was printed in massive quantities, but carried no weight. It arrived in stacks, but moved nothing. It lingered in wallets, like paper, ghosts visible, but untouchable. And the more it was printed, the less it meant. The central bank continued to issue new notes, 1,000, but each was less useful than the last dot in Yaroslavl. A man was paid 3,000 rubles for a month's work at the textile factory. He used it to buy 4 tins of condensed milk. When asked what he thought about it, he shrugged. Milk tastes better than promises. And that was the pivot. People no longer thought in rubles. They thought in outcomes. What gets me food? What gets me warmth? What gets me past this week? Sometimes the answer was soap. Sometimes matches. Sometimes simply knowing the right person at the back of the queue. Connections became currency. Rumors, the new ledger. He's selling boots near the TRAM depot. They say sugar just came in near Savielsky market. There's a doctor in Arbet who still takes kindling. These weren't gossip. We were survival codes. Meanwhile, the official exchange rate had become satire. On paper, $1 equals 28 rubles. On the street, $1 equals 80, then 100, then 150. And still, dollars were rare. Only the lucky, the clever, or the criminal held them. For the rest, life was calculated in hunches. How long could one bottle of sunflower oil stretch? How many rubles would a jar of jam cost next week? How many days until the number on your salary lost another zero of meaning? Economists gave it names: hyperinflation, devaluation, systemic collapse. But in the stairwells of Krusiavkas, where people boiled potatoes on hot plates and washed laundry by hand, the names didn't matter. Only this did. The ruble had once stood for the promise that the state would provide. Now it was just paper and belief, like ink, fades, asterisk by the end of 1991. The ruble had become more artifact than asset. It still changed hands out of habit, mostly, but it no longer dictated the shape of life. It could not promise food, It could not anchor wages. It did not carry certainty. What it carried was memory in a country trained to believe in numbers 5-year plans, factory quotas, production targets. The vanishing meaning of its own currency marked a quiet unraveling. Not because money disappeared, but because it stayed, visibly, stubbornly. Useless. In late November, a bakery in Smolensk stopped accepting rubles entirely. Not because it wanted to protest, because the bakery's flour supplier now asked for firewood instead. The city government threatened a fine. The bakery complied. And then reopened under a new name, Cooperative No. 1. Inside, prices were posted in flour. 1 kilo of biscuits equals 3 scoops of rye flour. 1 loaf equals a bag of coal dust. No rubles accepted. Customers didn't argue. They brought sacks. They brought jars. They lined up before sunrise in a rural clinic near Tula. A nurse accepted eggs as payment for wound dressings. A teacher there was, paid with goat cheese. In Novokuznetsk, a cobbler began etching the date and value of each transaction into a leather ledger. Since no other record would hold, when a woman gave him a can of petrol for a pair of mended boots, he nodded. I trust. Petrol more than rubles. Others began writing receipts with both prices, one in rubles, one in barter. Rubles were still the language of official things. Rent, tax, utilities. But even those, increasingly, were settled in favors. A landlord in Nizhny Tagil accepted plumbing, work in place of December rent. A municipal clerk in Irkutsk forgave fines in exchange for heating bricks. What emerged was not chaos, but adjustment. And behind it all, the ruble sat quietly in drawers and coat pockets, too familiar to throw away, too hollow to spend. People still collected them. They still counted them, but they no longer believed. In one apartment block in Selyabinsk, children used them to build card houses. They folded 25 ruble bills into cranes. A grandmother watching from the window muttered, I remember when we whispered before tearing money. Oh, no one whispered. The destruction was casual, not angry, just tired. In Moscow, the markets brimmed with noise, not with shouting, but with movement. Crates being dragged, prices shifting mid-sentence. A man tried to buy apples with a crisp 100 ruble note. The vendor didn't blink. Give me thread, she said. He returned 15 minutes later, holding 2 spools of blue cotton. She gave him 5 apples. No one asked who was in charge anymore. Not the state, not the bank, not the store managers, not the price boards. The system that once commanded value from a central tower had splintered into 1,000 private understandings. And those understandings were fragile, improvised, and deeply human. And yet, the government kept printing. In December, new ruble notes were issued again, larger denominations, cleaner designs, this time with 5,000 printed across the top. People looked at them the way you look at a postcard from someone you no longer know. In a tea stall on the edge of Pushkin Square, a retired economist asked the vendor how much a cup cost. The vendor replied, What do you have? That was the new language. What do you have? Not, what is it worth? Not, what does the government say? But, what remains? Some still hoarded rubles, hoping they might mean something again. Others used them as notepads. One artist began painting over ruble bills, transforming them into small icons of saints. He sold them at the train station. A foreign journalist asked him why saints. He shrugged, because they still mean something. And so the ruble, once the spine of a planned economy, dissolved into metaphor. It became wallpaper, kindling, toys, receipts, canvas, and sometimes just paper. A man in Omsk wallpapered his hallway with bills. When asked if it was political, he said, no, they were the only thing that came on time. And that was the joke, because in the final months of the Soviet Union, The only part of the economic system that worked without interruption was the part that produced money. Money that didn't mean anything. Money no one trusted. Money that could no longer be explained by December 25th, 1991. The ruble still existed, but the country that gave it meaning did not. And in that quiet vacuum between belief and habit, between value and function, the people turned to each other. They made their own rules, their own rates, their own currencies of trust, not with coins, but with tea, with favors, with warmth, and with the quiet, steady realization that the most dangerous kind of collapse is not loud. It is the kind that folds inwards, silently, while the world continues, as if nothing has changed, until one day you look at the money in your hand and realize it has become a memory. Asterisk, it was January 1991, and Vilnius had grown too quiet in the days leading up to it. The air had been thick with breath of journalists, of mothers, of boys with trembling hands piling furniture at the foot of buildings. It was cold, not Siberian cold, but sharp enough to crack hope into smaller pieces. Still, they came. Farmers drove in from villages. Students left their dorms. Workers walked out of factories. Not in protest, but in purpose. They came because they heard the tanks were coming. The Lithuanian parliament had declared independence from the Soviet Union 9 months earlier. Not through violence, not with weapons, just with a vote. A quiet, legal, hopeful vote. A declaration written on paper, not shouted from barricades. And that is what made Moscow furious, because the page could not be silenced with troops. And yet, they sent them anyway. At first, they were training exercises, then protective deployments. But everyone knew what it was. You could hear it in the engine growls outside the radio station. You could see it in the faces of the soldiers, many barely 20, who looked up at the windows above them and saw grandmothers holding candles. The city began building barricades, not, like in war movies, with whatever they had. City buses were parked in intersections, asterisk park benches, tires, shopping carts, old planks of firewood dawed to the entrances of buildings. Windows were taped in X's. Radios were kept on day and night. Tea was brewed in vast metal kettles, passed out in paper cups by people who knew this might be the last warm thing they gave. The target was clear. The Vilnius TV tower, because in a war without declarations, media is the first battlefield. If the tower fell, the signal would go dark. If the signal went dark, the story would be whatever Moscow said it was. And so, on the night of January 12th, they gathered thousands of civilians, unarmed, tired, dressed in winter coats and scarves and things they could run in. They stood between tanks and truth and waited. It began just after midnight. APCs rolled forward with cruel patience. Soldiers with blank eyes advanced through snow. Some carried batons, others rifles. They moved with purpose, not vengeance, not bloodlust, just the cold mechanical certainty of orders. The crowd did not disperse. They sang. Some stood arm in arm. Others knelt. They sang Lithuanian hymns, songs that had survived empires, songs that once had to be whispered behind doors, songs that now rang through cold air like a question. Who would protect them? Who was listening? Moscow was watching. So was the West, but no one moved because the world did not know what to do with a revolution this silent. When the first shots rang out some in the air, some not, the crowd flinched, but didn't scatter. When the tanks rolled closer, crushing barricades like cardboard, they held their ground. One young man, just 17, stood in front of a tank with nothing but a flag in his hands. They ran him over. He was one of 14 people who died that night. They were students, electricians, grandfathers, a nurse, a journalist, ordinary names that became permanent marks on a cold January calendar. And still, no country intervened. No soldiers from NATO arrived. No urgent UN Council session. Only statements, expressions of concern, warnings not to escalate. And so the Lithuanian people defended the TV tower with their bodies. Some were pushed back, others dragged by dawn. The signal had flickered, but the story had spread, because even as Soviet troops seized the tower, people with handheld cameras had captured everything. Photographs, grainy video, first-person tape recordings. Evidence that truth had not been buried under treads. By morning, Vilnius was changed. The people had not won, but neither had the tanks, because the world had seen, and more importantly, Lithuanians had seen each other. Seen who stayed, who sang, who stood without orders, and who did not. Back in Moscow, official media tried to spin the events, claimed provocateurs, claimed a mob, claimed confusion. But even inside the USSR, no one believed it anymore. The footage was too clear, and the silence from Moscow had already become part of the story. But why didn't anyone stop it? Why did the tanks roll in, and no one from the larger world stepped forward to say, enough? The answer is not loud. It is quiet, like bureaucracy, like fear, like hesitation, like geopolitics written in long, slow sentences. But to those in Vilnius, huddled around wood stoves, pressing radios to their ears, the message was loud enough. You are alone. And still, they stayed. They stood in front of tanks without blinking. They handed out tea to strangers. They sang in their own language, because if the ruble had lost its meaning, and the Soviet promise had gone hollow, and Moscow had gone deaf, then maybe the act of standing together was the only form of currency that still worked. Asterisk, when the broadcast went dark, the streets grew darker too. The TV tower had been taken. The last images aired were shaky and brief, crowds scattering, soldiers shouting, then nothing, just static. A humming void, and in that void, the question returned, where was everyone else? Where were the allies, the diplomats, the forces that had once drawn red lines on maps and called them sacred? Where were the promises? But this wasn't a Cold War headline. It wasn't Budapest in 1956 or Prague in 1968. This was quieter, slower, unfolding without uniforms or declarations. And it left the people of Lithuania with a deeper realization that even in moments of clarity, the world may still look away. And yet, the people stayed. After the storming of the TV tower, they regrouped, returned to the barricades. This time, to protect the Supreme Council building Lithuania's parliament, where the Declaration of Independence still lived. Guarded by desks and old furniture stacked floor to ceiling, volunteers built new barricades. Chains of students passed sandbags, tire after tire, from hand to frozen hand. Inside, deputies slept on chairs and under tables. Some wrote farewell letters to family. Some prayed. Some sharpened pencils in case there was still time to draft another appeal. Outside, families delivered food in cloth bundles, soup, bread, hard-boiled eggs, as if nourishment itself could keep the walls from falling. It wasn't defiance. It was resolve, and that resolve turned into structure. Makeshift kitchens were set up on street corners, some medical tents beside fire barrels, maps pinned to plywood boards showing which intersections needed more bodies, more eyes, more ears. People took shifts. They sang less now, but the quiet was stronger, because now they weren't just guarding a building. They were guarding the right to exist as they were, even if no one saved them, even if no help came, even if the world continued to speak in gentle tones of concern and dialogue. The radio, not the television, became the lifeline. Radio Vilnius, Vilnius from hidden locations broadcast updates every hour. Announcers used their own names. They spoke slowly, clearly, not like broadcasters, like people trying to reach someone through fog. Barricades still holding. No new attacks overnight. Volunteers needed at the eastern perimeter. Signal was weak, but the voice was steady. Some listeners kept their radios pressed against their chests while they slept, as if warmth could be transmitted through static. In Moscow, Gorbachev claimed he had not ordered the assault. He said the military acted independently. The generals said they acted on behalf of national unity. No one took responsibility, and so the tanks stayed parked just beyond the barricades, not moving, just waiting, like a shadow that hadn't decided what shape it would take. But even as the soldiers waited, the lines around the Supreme Council grew. People arrived in cars and on foot, from the countryside, from smaller cities, some with candles, some with nothing, coats and eyes and hands that were ready to hold a wall, or another hand, or the weight of uncertainty inside the parliament. Members refused to evacuate. They passed motions, recorded votes, typed resolutions on aging typewriters, powered by small gasoline generators. One said, "Let this be our last meeting, if it must be, but let it also be ours." That line was read into the record by candlelight, and someone clapped just once. Then silence again. Western journalists, huddled in nearby hotels, sent dispatches out by phone and fax describing what was happening, not as a war, but as a standoff of memory against muscle. One wrote, "Vilnius has no army, just people in layers of sweaters standing where tanks are meant to pass." Another wrote, "They are being abandoned politely," and still no government moved. The United States issued a statement urging restraint on all sides. The European community requested de-escalation. The United Nations debated whether the situation qualified as internal, and the people listening through radios held against their ribs understood they were not unimportant. They were inconvenient, and that is often worse, because inconvenience doesn't provoke rescue, it provokes delay. So the people continue to defend what they had declared, with no weapons, no guarantees, and no deadline for relief. And every day the barricades stayed up. Something shifted, not in Moscow, but in the minds of Lithuanians. A shift from hope and rescue, to trust in one another. A new belief: if we are not saved, we must still be worth saving. And that belief is what held the barricades longer than any army could have. But what does it mean when the world watches a small nation stand without? Sealed sand offers only the comfort of televised sympathy. What remains after a people realize they were seen but not chosen? Asterisk, no orders were given. No press release announced it. But one morning, the tanks were gone. Not all at once, not with ceremony. Just fewer today than yesterday. Then fewer again, until finally the last one rolled back through the slush, cracked mud curling in its wake, and didn't return. The barricades remained for days after, not because people still feared an attack, but because no one knew what their absence meant. Did withdrawal mean success? Did it mean defeat? Or just that the world had found something else to care about? The buildings stayed boarded. The volunteers kept watch. The radio station still broadcast hourly, though with more music between the updates. Deputies in Parliament spoke with softer voices. Candles kept burning, but something had shifted. Not in Moscow, not in Washington, in Vilnius. Something had hardened beneath the skin. Not anger, not triumph, something quieter. The sense that, in the end, it had not been guns or diplomacy that preserved their claim, but stillness. They had not overthrown an empire. They had simply refused to stop being themselves, and the empire, unable to explain what they were doing wrong, retreated, not just physically, but morally. International statements finally arrived in full recognition from Iceland, then Denmark, then more. But they came not during the blood, but after the cameras moved on. And inside Lithuania, this was not forgotten. The names of the dead were etched into stone, not with heroism, asterisk, but with precision, dates, ages, occupations, no titles, no slogans, because they had not died for a revolution. They had died standing between silence and surrender. And that Lithuanians now understood was more permanent than declarations. At the funerals, thousands gathered. It was cold. People wore black scarves. Some carried candles. Others just stood, not crying, just watching, listening. The eulogies spoke not of victory, but of endurance, of patience, of walls held, of streets remembered, of nights spent in cars, waiting for tanks that turned away. Mothers spoke of sons who carried thermoses to the barricades. Fathers spoke of daughters who sang even after the signal went dark. A nation spoke of itself not as a cause, but as a presence, one that refused to vanish. And across the other Baltic republics, Latvia, Estonia, the story was not lost. Barricades rose there too, songs returned, and people, seeing what had happened in Vilnius, realized something strange and steady, that Moscow could bring tanks, but Moscow could no longer bring obedience. The narrative was changing, not with explosions, but with crowds, not with loud declarations, but with quiet consistency. It would take months before the world formally acknowledged the shift. It would take years for borders to be redrawn on maps. But the people already knew, because they had stood, and no one came. Still, they stood. The memory of that abandonment did not become bitterness. It became foundation, a knowledge that help may not arrive. Dignity can be sustained without it, a knowledge that nations are not built with rescue. They are built with restraint, with barricades made of buses and benches, with songs sung over gun barrels, with the decision to exist even when no one guarantees it. And in the years that followed, Ukrainian children asked what independence felt like. Their parents did not speak of flags or speeches or leaders. They spoke of standing in the cold, of holding hands, of waiting through the night beside strangers, of hearing the tanks and not moving, because sometimes history is not shaped by battles, but by moments survived without rescue. Asterisk, there was always a file on you, on your neighbor, on your teacher, on the postman who stopped to talk too long at the corner, on the janitor who read band poetry in his spare time, on the woman who received 2 letters a month from Latvia, even on the men inside the KGB itself. Everyone had a file. It was the quiet logic of the state. By the end of 1991, the KGB was still writing them, still opening folders, still logging observations, still recording names, dates, suspicions, photographs, still marking documents with red pencil slashes and rubber stamps that no longer frightened anyone. But something had changed. The files had stopped moving up. There was no one left to read them. The Central Committee was dissolving. The ministries were silent. Even the Politburo had thinned. Decisions still floated in the air, but no one reached out to catch them. The KGB's work, the work of watching, continued like muscle memory, but the purpose had faded, because a surveillance state can only exist if someone acts on what is seen. And now, they were watching a country collapse in slow motion. No one wanted to be the one to write down why. Inside a gray concrete building on Jasinski Square, a man named Mikhail sat at his desk. He had worked there for 26 years. His job was not dramatic. He did not wear a trench coat. He did not carry a pistol. He was not a spy. He was a clerk. His task was to review reports from regional offices on unrest, foreign influence, religious gatherings, anti-Soviet leaflets, factory meetings, unusual phone calls. He logged the ones worth watching, passed them up the chain. But lately, there was no chain, just desks, empty chairs, papers that gathered dust before being moved to archives that no longer archived anything. One morning in October, he received a report marked Urgent Lithuanian Sector. Hey, it was 3 pages long, tightly typed, detailed to describe rising cooperation between Baltic dissident groups, cross-border meetings, a printing press smuggled through Latvia, radio broadcasts transmitting interviews with former Soviet scientists 10 years earlier. This report would have triggered a flurry of responses. Now, Mikhail signed it, filed it, and placed it on the shelf. He didn't know what else to do, because the deputy who used to review such files had stopped coming to work in August. His replacement lasted 2 weeks, then no one, and Mikhail had stopped asking. Instead, he made tea. Instead, he read old files. Instead, listened to the sound of the lights buzzing overhead. He wasn't alone. Across the country, KGB offices still functioned. Technically, phones still rang. Field agents still reported, but the urgency had gone hollow. In Ukraine, surveillance of nationalist groups continued, but no one acted. In Armenia, reports warned of separatist rhetoric, but the tapes were never reviewed. In Georgia, a small team followed 2 student leaders for 3 days and then stopped. Their supervisor had been reassigned to liaison work, which meant, wait, what the KGB had always feared was disorder. What it never anticipated was neglect, that no one would read the files, that no one would reply to memos, that the center would stop being interested, that the system might end, not with betrayal, but with disinterest. Mikhail sometimes opened old files from the 1970s, just to feel that sense of motion again. He reread case summaries, watched how quickly directives had been issued, how clean the orders looked on the page. Now, the files were longer, more uncertain. They contained words like likely and suggested impossible infiltration. Because when no one listens, even surveillance becomes hesitant. In November, he was asked to prepare a year-end summary of threat indicators from all 15 republics. He laughed, not because it was funny, because it had always been a ritual, not a necessity. And now, even the ritual was transparent. He typed the summary, 10 pages, included every region, every known dissident cluster, every suspected foreign NGO, every instance of seditious pamphlets or coded broadcasts. At the end, added the sentence, not from protocol, further action, unclear, awaiting instruction. He printed it, stamped it, and never heard back. The final report of the KGB in 1991 was filed, indexed, numbered, but it was too late, because people were no longer afraid of files. They were building countries. They were singing again in open squares. They were refusing orders, ignoring curfews, printing newspapers, holding elections that had no permission from Moscow. And the KGB built to observe. Vorkuta only observed. It had no orders, no state to defend, no fear to exploit, only files, thousands and thousands of them, organized, precise, irrelevant. But what happens to a surveillance machine when no one believes in the consequence of being seen? What is left to watch when the subject no longer looks back? The fear had once been efficient. It didn't need many words. It lived in glances, in pauses, during phone calls, in the way voices dropped when certain topics arose. It lived in the ritual of walking past the Lubyanka building without turning your head, in the careful crossing out of names from party invitations, in the knowledge that somewhere, someone was always writing something about someone. But by late 1991, fear was beginning to lose its shape. In Minsk, a retired schoolteacher named Raisa received a visit from a man who introduced himself as from security. He asked about her son. He asked about the books he was reading. She answered each his question calmly, then offered him tea. She said, "Do you still write these things down?" The man didn't reply. He declined the tea and left. She later told a neighbor, "They still come, but they seem confused now." The confusion wasn't just personal. It was structural. For decades, the KGB had understood its purpose: protect the state from dissent, sabotage, sedition, spies. But what if the state itself was dissolving? What if the lines blurred between legal and illegal, between republic and nation, between loyalty and survival? In Tallinn, KGB agents debated whether to continue recording the names of those attending independence rallies. I said, "Yes, protocol." Another said, "No waste of time." A third said, "Who will even read it?" And that was the turning point, when surveillance becomes ceremonial. It stops being surveillance. It becomes history. Mikhail, a clerk in Moscow, knew this. He had watched the daily logbook grow thin. Fewer reports, fewer calls. Asterisk, fewer people walking through the door. One day, he walked down to the archives rows upon rows of gray cabinets, humming under weak lights. He pulled out a folder from 1983. The subject, a poet. She had written one forbidden verse about the moon not belonging to the state. 20 pages of surveillance. One audio tape. A photograph. It's taken at a bus stop. It had felt so important then. He held it now, like something left behind on a train. Dusty, still legible, but disconnected from the world outside. Outside, the world was changing faster than the KGB could write it down in Georgia. The headquarters had been overrun, might violently, put by clerks from the new national government, who walked in and asked for the keys. In Estonia, agents were told to leave quietly. Some did. Others just stopped showing up. In Ukraine, records were burned. In Latvia, they were copied. In Lithuania, young archivists moved boxes of surveillance files into locked university rooms, not for preservation, but for reckoning. Asterisk,